China, 1837, in the province of Guangdong, lies a small village named Fuyan Springs, and a man there has lost his mind. Hong Ji Quan has failed his imperial test for the third time, and the reality of failure was too much for him to bear. He had a nervous breakdown, and then for days fell into a coma-like state. During this time, Hong is said to have been given visions from his true father, his celestial father, and met his true brother, Jesus. It won't be until 6 years after his mental breakdown and a chance meeting with his cousin and reading the Christian pamphlets that were given to him that he makes the connection between his visions and the Christian God. And when he does, China will never be the same. Over the course of 14 years, somewhere between 20 and 30 million people will have their lives cut short, all because one man failed a test. Hello there everyone, I hope you're doing well. This video is going to be about the Taiping Rebellion and its leader Hong Ji Quan. But first, we'll need to dive into China a little bit and what was going on there at the time and see how a rebellion like this could have even taken shape in the first place, and why, at this time, much of the population of China was willing and ready to rebel against their government. Firstly, China wasn't ruled by ethnic Han Chinese people at the time. The ruling class was made up of Manchu people. Now, the Manchu people, they came into China back in the 1500s and established a ruling dynasty. Well, 2 ruling dynasties over China that lasted from 1644 all the way until 1912, when the Qing dynasty was dethroned. The anti-Manchu sentiment was very strong all over China, but for a while, the Manchus, they did do a decent job of running the country, and everything ran smoothly, so the Chinese population could live with being under the rule of foreigners, as long as those foreigners kept everyone safe, kept trade flowing, and didn't allow too much foreign interference from Europe, because the Chinese, they could deal with other Asians being in charge, but in no way were they going to let the Europeans come in here and start dictating things. Well, the Manchu let the British of all people come into China and start dictating things. Okay, well, they didn't let them in. A little something called the First Opium War took place. Now, I could spend hours talking about the Opium Wars, but the gist of it all is that the British Empire went to war with China for the right to be able to sell drugs in China. Now, you might be thinking that's insane, but I promise you that's what it was about. The British, they had nothing really to offer China in terms of goods for trade, so while China was exporting all this stuff and barely importing anything, they were making big bucks. Of course, the British didn't like this, and they decided that opium would be what they sold to the Chinese. Opium is a drug. Now, things got so bad in China with opium that the emperor at the time banned the use and sale of the drug because it was destroying his countrymen. The levels of abuse and use and addiction to opium were astronomical. Like, even compared to today's use of marijuana, it was quite literally destroying China. William Ewart Gladstone, a former Prime Minister of Britain, he had this to say about the whole ordeal. A war more unjust in its origin. A war more calculated in its progress to cover this country with permanent disgrace, I have not heard of. The tensions rose between the Chinese and the British until a full-on war broke out, and sadly for the Chinese, in the end, the British won, and the sale of opium was made legal again. But even more devastating to the ruling Manchus was the fact that they had just lost against a European foe, completely shattering any kind of faith that the Chinese people had in their government. You know, you guys are supposed to be the strongest and protect China from things like this from happening. And now you've lost a war against foreigners and have capitulated to them. Why are you in charge again? And on top of losing the First Opium War, pretty much everything else in China was cheeks as well. Famine, it was completely rampant all across China at this time. The lower classes, they were being taxed very heavily, and the farmers, they were really feeling the burden since most of their crops were failing, and they were still having to pay the same kind of tax rates as they were in the good years. Alongside the humiliation of losing to the British and everyone being addicted to opium, local groups of bandits began to be a major problem for the people, and the Manchu government, again, was nowhere to be found in dealing with these criminal groups. that were robbing anybody whom they could find. Now, this actually did lead to many local defense groups, which would clash with the bandits on a regular basis, because, the government just wasn't there to help, so people had to defend themselves somehow. This is the world Hong Ji Quan lives in. Hong was born into a Hakka clan. The Hakka Han were a subgroup of the Han Chinese people, so they were true Chinese, if you'd like to say that, unlike the Manchu people. I have no idea if that's racist or not, so don't hate me. His clan was actually quite well off during the times of the Song dynasty. Apparently, the clan had multiple high officials and imperial advisors during that time. But ever since the Song dynasty had fallen, over time the clan had mostly become poor farming folk, living in two villages about 30 miles north of the city of Canton. Hong lived in Fuyanshi village, which is said to be the ancestral home of the Hong clan. In this small village that Hung grew up in was a very modest school. Well, really, it was just a small brick building, not a real school or kind of in any sense of the word, but Hong's and his family, they held education in very high regards, and it was at the age of 7 that Hong began to study the Confucian classics. And by the time he was a teenager, Hung had become very, very well read and quite the smart young man. In fact, he was so promising that his family, and really kind of his whole clan, put everything they had behind Hung, in hopes that one day he would be able to return the clan to its elevated status in society. Some teachers, they would even apparently accept not getting paid, just so that they could try and do their part to help Hung succeed in becoming a Qing official in the government. Now, the way you did that was by passing all of the imperial examinations. The imperial examination was a 3-day-long, grueling process that tested candidates on their writing, their knowledge of Chinese classics, and the literary style used among state officials. These tests, they were taken in what's called exam cells. So you can pretty much just picture a jail cell, which you stay in for 3 days while trying to do fucking really hard tests. Hong's first attempt at the imperial exams was in 1827, and on the first day of the exams, he actually placed very highly amongst his peers. But by the time the second day had finished, he had fallen behind, and by the third day, he had not made the cut, failing the exam for the first time and being forced to return home. And for the next 9 years, Hung will spend his time working in the fields, studying more, and then eventually becoming a school teacher in his village, as well as some of the other villages in the vicinity of his. So, skipping forward a bit here to the year 1836, and Hung, he takes his second attempt at the imperial examinations, but on this trip to Guangzhou, the city where the exams were to be held, fate, or destiny, whatever you want to call it, had something else in store for Hung. As he made his way through the bustling city streets, he came upon a white dude by the name of Edwin Stevens. Now, Mr. Stevens was a missionary, and he was traveling around China with an interpreter trying to convert people to Christianity, the things Christians frickin' did back then. With them, they carried a pamphlet called Good Words for Exhorting the Age, which they gave to Hung. Now, Hung, he didn't even read the pamphlet or pay much attention to it at first, but in time, this moment will come to be a defining one in the history of the Taiping. Oh, yeah, and also Hung failed his exams for the second time. This time, though, Hung, he only waited 1 year to try again, so in 1837, he took his third attempt at completing the exams and failed again. Now, this was the last straw for Hung. He could not handle the news of failure for a third time. His brain broke, and he had a nervous breakdown. Hung, he had to be carried home, and when he got there, he just fell into his bed and began to call his family to his side. He told them all how sorry he was and that he had completely failed them and he couldn't go on knowing he had let them all down. And then it said that Hung lost all of his strength, closed his eyes, faded away, and began to dream. In his dreams, a dragon, a tiger, and a rooster entered his room, followed by musicians and a sedan chair. They all carried him away to a wondrous and beautiful place full of people who rejoiced when they saw him, and an old woman who washed him to remove all defilements from his body. And then a group of old men appeared, and he recognized some of them to be the sages of ancient China. They opened up his body with a knife and removed his organs, replacing them with new, healthier ones, before closing him back up again. Not a trace of incision could be found afterwards, and he was escorted back to a grand hall where an old man in a black robe with a flowing golden beard sat upon a throne. The man said to him, "They take of my gifts and therewith worship demons. They purposefully rebel against me and arouse my anger. Do not, though, imitate them." The man then gave him a magical sword for which he said its purpose was to kill demons. But he told him to never use it on his brothers and sisters. Alongside this was a seal and a piece of yellow fruit, which Hong ate. The old man then led him to look upon the people of Earth where they could see both defilement and perversions. Now, Hung's dreams, they didn't just last for one night or day. Hung was actually in this state for 40 days. It said over the course of this time, he'd randomly jump up out of bed and start swinging his arms around, and he would say that he was slashing away at the demons. He told his family about he and his older brother would go all over the world and slay demons together, and that the man in the black robe would actually berate and put down the Chinese philosopher Confucius for not teaching the Chinese people the right doctrines. While Hung was going through this ordeal, his family had to confine him to one room in the house, and as word spread about the crazy sleeping guy who at one point claimed he was the Emperor of China, as that word spread, those rumors, people in Hung's village, they began to come and see him. But over time, Hung's mental state, it did seem to improve, and he kind of began to live a normal life again, except that apparently now, Hung, he was better than before. It said that he was now taller, stronger, more confident in himself, and even more handsome, with a piercing gaze that had become difficult to endure. Fucking must be nice to have a fucking nervous mental breakdown and you wake up fucking super sexy now. Now, we're going to have another little break in Hong's life because for the next several years after his mental breakdown and having all those visions, Hung returns just to a normal life. He began to study again and become a teacher, not only for his village, but again, many of the other villages around his own, and he lived quite a normal existence. That is, until the year 1843, when Hung decided to take the imperial exams one last time. And not surprisingly, he did fail again, but this time, soon after failing, Hung got a visit from his cousin, and his cousin reminded him of that weird little book they had been given years ago back in Canton, and told him, "Hey man, you should really check that out in detail. It might help you out a bit or something, you know. You never know. What's the worst that could happen?" If only he knew what he had just put into motion, because after Hung was done reading, he had an epiphany. The words he had just read had shown him, had made him realize who and what his dreams were about. Hung realized that the old man in the black robe, that was God, the Christian God, and that his older brother who would join him in killing demons all across the world, yeah, that was Jesus. Hung came to the conclusion that he was the literal Son of God, and that his father had tasked him in ridding all of China of the demons and non-believers. After this amazing realization, Hung went to two of his cousins, Hong Rengen and Feng Yunshan, and told them, "I have received the immediate command from God in his presence. The will of heaven rests with me." These two men, Rangan and Feng, will become Hong's first converts, and the three men began throwing away all the idols and Confucian texts they could find, as well as gathering as much Christian material as they could get their hands on, so that they could study and learn more about Hong's new dad and brother. It was also around this time that Hung had two huge swords made, one for him and one for Rangan, and they were both over 3 feet in length, about 3 feet 3 inches long, and over 10 pounds. So these were some big fucking swords. Like, you definitely wouldn't be able to actually use these in a fight. But they were made, and Hung called them the demon slaying swords. The three men also began to destroy Buddhist and Confucian statues wherever they could find them, and Hong and Rengan actually threw out all of the Confucian teachings and writings they had in their village, which did not go well with everybody else because to them Confucius was like, basically like Jesus is to Europeans. If somebody in the West started going around defacing statues and such of Jesus, it wouldn't be taken very kindly over here, and the villagers didn't take their statues being burned very kindly either. Rangan, well, his family, they really didn't like his new outlook on life. It is actually said that his brother actually beat him up with a stick for throwing away Confucian teachings from his school, which obviously, of course, lost the school students. Now, Hung and his new followers' antics, they weren't going unnoticed, and when the local authorities caught on to what he was doing, both he and Rangan were fired from their jobs as village tutors, and without those jobs, there was nothing really holding them down in place. So, they decided that they would travel around from village to village, preaching about Hung's new religion and trying to gather as many converts to them as they could. Also, they had no money, and people were mad at them, so they were like, we gotta get out of here. So, in the spring of April 1844, Hung and Feng Yunshan, they set out from their village to travel and preach. Hung Rengan, he wasn't allowed to go. He was only 20 at the time, and his father was like, hell no, you're staying right here. At first, the two men, they headed to the land surrounding Guangzhou and spent some time there preaching and gaining a little bit of converts in the various villages there. And when they were done, they headed to the north to White Tiger Village, where Hung and then Feng, they split ways. Then, Hung made a long journey, over 400 kilometers down south, to the village of Sigu, where some of his relatives lived. And it's believed that sometime during this period, Hung begins to write his first major work, Extortions to Worship the One True God. But it was only about 5 months later that Hung decided to return home alone and resume his job as a teacher, though he would still practice his religion in private. And for the next 3 years, Hung's existence kind of went back to normal again. It was an uneventful period in Hung's life, as far as I could find, but in the year of 1847, Hung received an invitation from a group of Chinese Christians to come and study with them under the guidance and leadership of American missionary and Reverend Issachar Jacox Roberts. Hung accepted this invitation, and he brought along Rengan, who was unable to come with him on his first trip 3 years earlier, but now was allowed. And there he studied both the Old and New Testament and was expecting to be baptized for a second time, like a real time. He thought this one would make it more official, but for some reason, Roberts refused to baptize Hung. Some believe that Hung was tricked into asking Roberts for a stipend, which put Roberts off because it made him think that Hung might be a rice Christian, which basically means he only was converting to Christianity so that he could receive some sort of benefit like rice or money since he was starving. Which some Chinese people, they were doing at the time, Of course, remember, many parts of China, they aren't doing so well at this time, so it wasn't out of the question. So after the refusal, Hung, he had no way of making a living as a preacher anymore, so he left and went in search of his cousin Feng, who he had not seen since they left each other years earlier. Now, apparently Hung was robbed on his journey to meet up with Feng, even losing the demon-slaying swords, but he did eventually make his way to Thistle Mountain, where he found Feng and 2,000 of his followers, who had begun to call themselves the God Worshippers. The reunion between Hung and Feng did go very well, and Hung immediately found himself now at the head of a growing religious and political movement that was beginning to become a force in its own right in its little local area, even if it was just in this one small area. And at this time, it was still prominently made up of just his Hakka people and the clan that he was from. A little while after Hung arrives, the local gentry from the area that the so-called God worshippers are living in, well, they got fed up with Feng, and they managed to get a militia together to arrest him for leading the people to paganism and revolt. He was then banished in 1848 to Guangdong. And while most of the rest of the group, they stayed back at Thistle Mountain, Hung did follow Feng, and in the absence of the two most prominent members and the leaders of it all, two other men emerged to become the new co-leaders of the movement, one Yang Ji-Qing and Zhao Chigui. Now, both of these men claimed to be like Hong, and that they too had visions and were given messages from God to relay to the people. More specifically, Yang said he was talking to God the Father, while Zhao, he claimed he was in direct contact with Jesus. When Hong and Feng eventually returned to the god worshippers, it said that they tested both the men vigorously to see if they were telling the truth, and in the end, both Hong and Feng were, I guess, convinced enough that they were being truthful. Now, a short time after Hong and Feng's return to Thistle Mountain, it was reported to Hong that not too far away there was a famous idol of Kang Yang, who in life had been a man who was told a prophecy that after a death in his family, great prosperity would come. So he went home and he killed his mom, and the story goes that it actually worked, and he apparently had a dope-ass life after that. And it was so dope that after his death, he began to be worshipped, but as a demon, not as a good spirit. So people were scared of this idol and its powers until Hung walked into its temple one day and started smacking the idol in the face with a stick. Then he told his boys to knock it over and smash it up, which of course they did. Hung said that this was the type of demon he would be slaying up in heaven with his dad when he went there. And this event spread quickly, and it actually helped to grow the god-worshipping society much faster than it was already. It was around 1850, after the group had grown to at least 10,000 people now, mostly Hakka Chinese, but also plenty of non-Hakka people as well. And the way they did this, they did it mostly just basically by being the only force strong enough in the area to deal with the rampant banditry that was going on. The Manchu government, they either didn't care, or more likely they were just unable to do anything about it with everything else they were dealing with, like the Tiandi-Hu rebellion. And because Hong's god worshippers seemed to be the only people doing anything about the bandits, and the lack of food and the famine, and the lack of response by the Manchu, it was only further legitimized Hong's group in the eyes of the people, so more and more of them began to flock to them. Now, Hong's father had passed away in 1849, and during mourning, Hong didn't shave his head or beard, which was against the law of the Manchu government. They forced every male to cut the hair the way the Manchu men did, and if you didn't, you could actually be executed for treason. I have a feeling Hong didn't care, though, because by this time, he had come to identify the Manchus and their government as the demons, and the ones that he was sent down to Earth to destroy. And by the time he had decided his enemy were the Manchus, the Hakka people had been kind of pissing off everybody else, moving into the area at large rates, sometimes raiding other villages and farms for food and supplies, and eventually it got so bad that the non-Hakka people would burn down the Hakka's homes. Now, this, of course, only led to more violence between Hakkas and non-Hakkas. Any Hakka person who wasn't a god worshipper quickly found themselves joining up with Hong, basically just for protection, as well again as many other non-Hakka people who were just looking for protection themselves from bandits. So, with the violence spreading throughout the Guangxi district, the Manchu government officials were eventually forced to take notice of Hong and his followers. They decided that everything that was going on, it was this Hong Jiquan guy and his followers' fault, and they needed to be dealt with. So, Qing officials, the Qing is the dynasty ruling China at the time, but they are of Manchu origin. Qing officials, they were sent to arrest both Hong and Feng at their homes, but the two men, they were warned of the approaching detachment of soldiers and they made their escape. Hong then called on his followers to gather at a town called Jiantin, and within days, some 10 to 30,000 people had gathered there and taken the town for the god-worshipping society. It was then in January 1851, the first day of the year actually, the Qing imperial forces were sent to take back the town and to end the rebellion, but Hong and his followers were able to set up an ambush near Kaijing village, where they defeated the Qing army and were even able to kill one of its commanders. 10 days later, on Hong's 38th birthday, Hong Jiquan called his followers together and officially declared the establishment of the Heavenly Kingdom of Peace, with himself as its leader. Now, we have finally reached what is known as the Taiping Rebellion. It took us a while, but we're here. Before we jump into the actual rebellion, though, I'll just do a quick rundown of things. China, at this time period, was really going through some tough times. The government had just lost a war against the British, and the population was addicted to drugs. There was a famine all over the country, and the bandits and pirates were getting really, really bad on top of it all. And there was multiple rebellions happening all over China as well. Into this situation steps Hong Ji Quan, who sucks ass at school apparently, and he fails his exams, leading him to have a nervous breakdown. And then years later, he begins to associate his dreams and visions with the Christian God, and one day comes to the conclusion he is the Son of God. Jesus is his brother, and his job in life is to rid China of the demons, which in time he comes to identify as the Manchu-run government and its people. Hong, after setting up his new kingdom, puts new orders and rules into place. First, dealing with the 13,000-man-strong army he was now in charge of. He divided his troops into 2,500-man-strong regiments, commanded by officers, then further into 500-man-strong battalions, which were then divided into 100-unit companies. And then those were further divided into 5 25-man-strong squads, led by a senior sergeant. He also created the Kings of the Four Directions, and those positions were given to the 4 men under him. Feng Yunshan was made the South King, Yang Jiqing was made the East King, and Zhao Chagui was made the West King, and Wei Changhui was made the North King. Hong himself, he took up the mantle of the Heavenly King, Lord of 10,000 years. In the years to come, another king position will be made, called the Flank King, or the Wing King, and that was under the control of a man named Shidi Kai. But we'll get to that later. Hong also implemented some social and religious reforms as well. He abolished the practice of foot binding, which, if you don't know what that is, good for you, but now I'm going to tell you. Foot binding was the practice of wrapping up a young girl's foot so that it would stunt the foot's growth and also cause it to become deformed. The bindings would be pulled so tight it would break toes and multiple bones in the poor girl's foot. They did this because human beings are stupid? Like, I don't know. Like, no, seriously, like, there's no other way I could explain this. Like, could you imagine sitting a young girl down, maybe your daughter or niece, and then breaking their feet and toes just because apparently the shape of the foot looks better that way? These were lifelong injuries and caused disabilities to the point, like, half your population was crippled and couldn't walk properly. Or, walk at all. I mean, at least the upper class women of society, because no way, I don't think the poor women could do this. They needed their feet to work, I'm assuming. If you can see in the photo here, this lady's toes are completely smushed up and bent under the soles of her foot. Hong also implemented a very strict separation of the sexes, at one point even splitting up family members of the opposite sex. Now, of course, Hong and the other Taiping leaders, they had multiple concubines for themselves, but for the rank and file, the opposite sex was off limits. Hong also tried to implement more of a socialist outlook on things, you could say, getting rid of land privatization and putting limits on things like private trade. He also did away with Confucianism and other, Chinese folklore, and officially instated the Taiping Bible and Taiping Christianity, which held the belief that Hong was the younger brother of Jesus and the second son of God. And Buddhist and Confucian monasteries and libraries were, of course, they were burned, and any idols that the Taiping got their hands on were destroyed. Now, while Hung is establishing his new kingdom and setting up the rules and regulations for everything, the Qing forces, they were gathering. The Qing's government goal at this time, it was to try and just keep the rebels hemmed in and make sure they didn't break out of Jiantin, start spreading the rebellion all over the place. But that failed, and after a hard-fought battle, the Taiping were able to escape and make their way toward the town of Yonggan. Though during the fighting, the West King Zhao Chagui was injured, and this caused Hong to give authority over the other kings to Yang Jiqing, which in the future will turn out to be a bad move. Hong and his followers, they stayed in Yonggang for about 3 months until the imperial forces, they were able to regroup and launch another attack. Again, though, they failed to defeat the god worshippers, and it said that even without gunpowder, the Taiping were able to fight their way out of the siege using only swords and spears. So now, the 40,000 strong army, they gathered some more recruits. They made their way towards the city of Guilin and tried to take that, but after 33 days of siege, Hung decided to resume his march north. During this journey north, the South King, Feng Yunshan, and one of Hong's closest friends and founding members of the Taiping, remember, it was he who actually created the god-worshipping society. Well, Feng was shot and killed by a sniper on this march. It said that as the army marched by the city of Quanzhou, Feng got too close to the city walls while being carried on his sedan chair, and some Qing gunner on the walls took his shot, and his aim turned out to be true. In retaliation for losing one of its head members, the Taiping army turned and sacked the city of Quanzhou, and ended up killing about 90% of the people who lived there, men, women, and children. After they were done with Quanzhou, the Taiping continued marching north alongside the Zhang River, where they were ambushed by imperial forces, and in fighting, some 10,000 Taiping soldiers were killed, either due to the actual fighting itself or by drowning in the river. And sadly for Hung, most of the casualties of this ambush, they were actually from his home province of Guangxi, many of them being some of the original god worshippers and people he had converted years ago. The 10,000 lost, they did suck at the time, but while the army is traveling, freaking my mouth didn't work there for a second. While they're traveling, they will recruit some 50,000 more people to their cause. Except most of these new recruits, they didn't really look at this as a rebellion of religion or a religious uprising, but more as just a way to get rid of the ruling Qing dynasty. Like, I think most of them probably didn't subscribe to Hung's religious ideologies. They just wanted the Qing gone. Now, unable to break out to the north because of Qing blockades, but also with some victories under their belt, the Taiping, they decide it's time to go on the offensive against the Qing government. They decide to turn west and head into the province of Hunan, where they faced very little resistance until they found themselves outside the walls of a city called Changsha. When Zhao Chigui, the West King, and the Taiping forces he was commanding first arrived at Changsha, they fought a battle against the Qing forces stationed there, managing to kill about 900 of the defenders before they were forced to retreat behind the walls. And then for the next 6 days, the Taiping repeatedly attacked the walls of Changsha, while the Qing defenders fought them off with everything they had, including throwing boiling water and oil over the walls, and crushing the Taiping attackers' skulls with rocks launched from the parapets. With the siege grinding on slowly and no real progress being made, Zhao, the West King, could see his troops' morale, start to drop a little bit, so he decided he would go to the front lines, or close to the front lines, and make an appearance to his men to boost their spirits. And dressed in his royal robes and armor, he personally picked up some Taiping banners and began making his way down the line, giving encouragements to, all his men. Well, somebody on the walls of Changsha must have spotted him and been like, that guy with the fancy clothes on, he must be pretty important. And it's not known if it was an actual artillery round or an actual sharpshooter that eventually did him in, but Zhao Chigui, the West King and one of the leaders of the Taiping Rebellion, was brought down that day and never got back up. But now Hung, he wasn't actually at Changsha. He and Yang Jiqing, the East King, they were at a place called Chenzhou. But when they heard about the death of Zhao, the two men gathered their forces and rushed over to Changsha as fast as they could, where they were able to defeat the Qing forces and even captured a Qing general, whom they promptly publicly executed in front of the walls. But again, the defenders were able to hold up inside the city, and the Taiping were unable to get inside. There was one time where a breach in the walls, it was opened up, but the Qing commander Zhao Zongtang told everybody in the city that he would give large sums of money to anybody in the city who helped fill the gap. So many citizens threw whatever they could, including their own, like their own furniture from their own house and everything, into the breach, and eventually it was closed. A quick side note: this guy, General Zhao Zongtang, yeah, it's this guy, this chicken that you're eating. With the efforts of the Taiping not really getting them anywhere, after months and months of brutal fighting over the city of Changsha and its surroundings, Hong Jiquan and Yang Jiqing, they decide that the city wasn't worth it at all. All this death. So in the middle of the night, Hung ordered his troops to fall back from their positions and to fall in line of march because they were headed to a more important city, the city of Wuchang. After leaving Changsha, the Taiping made their way north following the Jiang River up to Dongting Lake, where they initially took the town of Yuyang on the east side of the lake while facing very little resistance, and then instead of going directly for Wuchang, Taiping forces were sent to take the two towns of Hanyang and Hankou, which were on the northern shore. And when these two towns were taken, the Taiping gathered up as many boats as they could find and strapped them all together to create two huge floating bridges so that they could cross the Yangtze and attack Wuchang's northern defenses, which were its weakest. Inside the city, the commander of its defense, Chang Jiachun, was surprised to hear of the attack on the northern wall with cannons, but he gathered himself and quickly ordered that all the gates be closed and that messages be sent to the other Qing forces in the area. The major Qing city was now besieged by the Taiping. He also ordered that all homes and buildings outside the walls be burnt down to give the defenders on the wall a better line of sight, which didn't go down very well with some of the city's inhabitants. Some histories say that some of the civilians were actually helping the Taiping in this siege because they were so upset about the burn order. Zhang Rong, a Qing commander, and his forces reached Wuchang on the 7th of December and almost immediately began fighting with the Taiping in the suburbs outside the city walls. But Chang didn't sally his forces out from within Wuchang so that the Taiping, they were able to repel Rong's men, and then were able to continue the siege and started digging tunnels towards the walls. Then, on January 12th, after a hard-fought siege, the Taiping tunnelers had reached the Wencheng Gate and detonated multiple barrels full with gunpowder. The resulting explosion collapsed the gate and the walls around it, and the Taiping then flooded into the city. Chang Dachun, who was asleep at the time of the explosion, he was woken up, and when he heard that the city's defenses had been breached, he committed suicide. The Taiping went on to conquer the city and take all of its wealth. The Taiping, after taking Wuchang and continuing their march, arrived outside the walls of Nanking on March 6, 1853, with a total force of about 750,000 now. It had grown considerably since the sacking of Wuchang. Inside the city was 80,000 Qing defenders inside the city of Nanking. After a few days of fighting and a couple hundred losses on each side, Li Fenzhang, a Taiping general, called together a conference of the other generals, and during the meeting it was decided that on the 19th a large-scale attack would be launched at the walls of Nanking. And during the early morning hours of the 19th, the Taiping lined up hundreds and hundreds of horses on the western side of Nanking. It's just that those horses, they weren't carrying any soldiers. No, they were just carrying paper effigies of soldiers and torches to make it look like the Taiping were gearing up for a huge attack on this side of the city. And, they were eventually, but the real force was hiding much farther back because the horses and the fake soldiers were just a ruse. They were a ruse to draw as many Qing defenders over to this side of the city and as close to the walls as the Taiping could get them. Why? Well, the Taiping had been successful in digging 3 tunnels up to the western wall and were ready to detonate the gunpowder barrels they had inside them in hopes of collapsing the wall and killing as many Qing defenders as possible. The next thing the Qing defenders saw, after collecting themselves and getting their hearing back after the explosion, was a massive 40-meter gap in the wall and the Taiping soldiers rushing across the field to come smashing through the breach. Now, many of the Qing officials, they did manage to escape the city, but the Qing general Zhang Zhu and about 8,000 troops and their families retreated into the most defensible part of the city to make their final stand. And after a few days, they were able to hold out, defeating wave after wave of Taiping troops, putting down around 3,000 of them. But when Yang Jiqing's offer to let the remaining defenders live if they were to just surrender was refused, he brought up a massive amount of artillery and began destroying the inner city piece by piece until the foot soldiers found a gap in the defenses and stormed through it, cutting down anybody who got in their way. General Zhanzu, knowing the battle was lost and that there was no escape, fell on his sword as all around him the Taiping went to work in slaughtering any Manchu they could find. Remember, Hong's mission was to rid China of the demons, and sadly for the Manchus, they were the ones Hong was talking about. It said that between 20 and 30,000 civilians, men, women, and yes, even children, were put to the sword, with only 4,000 Taiping actually taking part in the killings themselves. That's a lot that's a lot. There's also a story saying how the Taiping marched all the Manchu women they found outside of the walls and then burned them alive. But I couldn't verify that 100%, so I don't know, it might not have happened, but, I mean, war is vicious. When the job of cleansing the city was done, the Taiping now found themselves in control of the second largest city in all of China. A city that had been home to multiple emperors and their imperial families in the past, and now Hong, some guy from a small little village and from a family of no importance, finds himself sitting upon an imperial throne. Now, after the capture of Nanking, Hong and the Taiping leadership, they implemented even more religious and social reforms, of course, starting with making God worship again the official religion. The Taiping went around burning, again, any Buddhist or Taoist temples they could find, and either arresting or executing their priests. They even went after the Chinese Roman Catholics and burned about 30 of them, while sending the rest of them to be cannon fodder on the front lines. For some reason, though, the Taiping were cool with the Chinese Muslims, so the mosques, they were completely left alone. The men and women of Nanking, they were separated as per the rules of the Taiping, and of course nobody liked that at all. Then the Taiping began executing prostitutes and their families, as well as any gay men that they could find in the city. Yeah. Not looking too good for them now, for the Taiping, I mean. Again, the Taiping abolished the practice of foot binding in the city as well, and they actually gave women much more rights, as well as allowing them to take the Taiping civil exams and serve in their own all-female military units. They, of course, outlawed the trade of opium as well. They also outlawed the buying and selling of slaves, so that's, good for them. The Taiping, they also began to mint their own coins, but they also outlawed the having of private wealth and fortunes, another little bit of, I guess, the socialism thing they were trying. But, of course, you could grow and make the things you needed, but any excess was supposed to be given over to the state so that they could collect the surplus goods and then redistribute them to the people in need. I mean, capitalists hate this kind of stuff. The Taiping actually implemented, Hong and the Taiping actually implemented quite a big land redistribution reform. Some say they very much had a communist type of vibe to them, where private wealth, it was looked down upon, and the supposed ideology was that Again, any of the surplus goods anybody made anywhere should be collected and then given out to the most in need. And no profit should be made off of the things people actually actually need. The idea was that all of the land the Taiping held, well, at least the farming land, was to be divvied up, and a plot of land given out to each man and woman over the age of 16, while anyone under the age of 16 was to receive half a plot. Hung also spent a lot of money building his new heavenly palace, which took about 6 months of hard work and around 10,000 workers. Now that Hung and his god worshippers they've succeeded in capturing a major city to make their capital, now Hung could begin to direct his attention towards his main goal, and that was to rid the country of China of the so-called Manchu demons again. The only problem is that as the power of the Taiping grew, the jealousy and internal strife amongst the Taiping leadership began to rear its ugly head. Now, Hung, like we've discussed, he's the top dog in the Taiping hierarchy, but there were the other kings who also held a lot of power on their own, and they each had their own personal following as well. After Hung, or really by this time right on the same level as Hung, was the East King, Yang Qing. Yang, he was one of the two guys that emerged as the leaders of the god worshippers when Hung and Feng, they got in trouble and had to leave the group for a while. Yang did that by claiming that God the Father spoke through him. And if you remember Zhao Chagui, the West King, the one that has died already, well, he was the other guy that became a leader of the Taiping, except that he claimed he could channel Jesus. These two, they seem to play off one another and use their trance-like states that they would go into to communicate the wishes of God and Jesus, aka themselves. It just so happens that I guess everyone believed them, even Hung and Feng. So over time, these two became more and more prominent in the Taiping. But when Zhao was killed outside the walls of Changsha, Yang led off the whole voice of God thing for a while, up until the year of about 1853, after the Taiping had control of Nanking. He then again began to fall into a trance-like state, I don't know how the hell people believe that, and received messages from God. The only problem is that those messages, they were beginning to become more and more critical of Hung. Yang claims God says that Hung, he had become too corrupt with power, too indulgent in his vices, and that he had grown to be too much of a poor leader. He even actually made the accusation that Hung had kicked one of his pregnant concubines in the stomach when she upset him, which is like, come on, Hung, come on, you can't be doing that type of stuff. There was even one incident where Yang ordered that Hung, the heavenly king, was to receive 40 blows from the rod for his failure as a leader of the Taiping in Yang's eyes. And Hung actually went to Yang and in public prostrated himself in front of him and everything and everybody else. He did the whole thing. He was completely ready to go through with it. But Yang, possibly realizing that he had gone a little bit too far, forgave Hung for whatever it was he needed to be forgiven for, and he called the beating off. Yang also began to feud with two other men, Wei Changhui, who was the North King, and also a man named Qing Rigang, who was a close friend of Hong's and had been with him since the beginning of this whole ordeal. Rigang, he was just a peasant from a mining family in the beginning, but over time he proved himself to be very useful to Hong, and he had been promoted to the rank of Marquis in the Taiping army. And Rigang, he was actually supposed to be given the title of king, one of the kings by Hung, but Yang actually had that shut down. Now, even though these two men, Wei and Rigang, were third and fourth in the Taiping leadership, Yang was second, and he also had the extra authority of being divine. See, it was only Hung and Yang who claimed to be connected to God in some way. Hung, as the brother of Jesus again, we know that, and Yang, like I said before, is basically the voice of God. So Wei and Rigang, they had no way of getting back at Wei or any way to really defend themselves from his divine accusations. Both Wei and Rigang were beaten on Yang's orders multiple times, And one of Wei's relatives was given 300 lashes after he pissed off Yang somehow. Yang also would just abuse his powers, just go after the family and friends of the other Taiping leaders and anyone he just didn't like. And it was very clear that he thought he was above the rest of them, and he wasn't afraid to show it. Yang became so arrogant that he actually went to Hong and said, "Hey man, so I know you're the leader and all, but like really I should be given the title of Lord of 10,000 years and you should take Lord of 9,000 years. I mean, come on, we all know I'm the one in charge here, so give me it." And Hong, at this time, he was pretty much alone in Nanking, since Yang, he had actually ordered the other three leaders away, Regang and now Shida Kai, we'll get to him in a minute, out of the city and on campaigns in different regions. But as soon as Hong heard of this, he sent messengers after the three generals to turn around and come back to Nanking. But until they return, he had to comply with the wishes of Yang. It was on September 1st, 1856, and it's been a couple of years now since they've taken Nanking, when Wei and Regang returned to Nanking with about 3,000 troops in tow, and they both met with Hong immediately and decided to take action as soon as possible. Now, it's not fully known whether or not Hong was privy to Wei's ultimate goal, or if he was even the one who ordered it to be done, but either way, on September 2nd, both Regang and Wei led their troops into the palace of Yang and began to slaughter anyone they came across, male or female, no matter the age or relation to Yang. Nobody in the palace was safe. Yang's entire family, all of his followers, and his courtesans, everyone was murdered. As for Yang, he died trying to flee the palace, but it's not known who cut him down. But his head was severed and then placed on a pole in the streets, and that is how Yang Qing, the other voice of God and a leader of the Taiping from early on, had his life end. When the night of death is finally over and the news of the massacre of Yang's family begins to be made known, and the reports of how the people are taking it start coming back, and they aren't good. People are not happy about this. Hong and Wei, they come up with a plan. Hong announces an edict that goes against the killing of Yang and his family, and also orders that both Regang and Wei be arrested for their crimes, and that each of them will receive 500 blows in public, and this beating will take place in the courtyard of Hong's palace. Hong then made sure to invite all of the rest of Yang's followers to attend the special event. There were about 6,000 of them left out in the city and, the surrounding areas. And of course, they were going to come watch the two men who just killed their master and his family be given their punishment. I said that Wei and Regang had killed them all, but those were just the ones inside Yang's personal palace, like his family and his close friends and soldiers, that were personally loyal to him. But there were still many, many more people that were loyal to Yang left. When the day came for the 500 blows to be given, many of Yang's followers made their way to Hong's palace and into the courtyard to get a better view. In the courtyard was Wei and Regang, and they were actually receiving blows until suddenly the beating stopped, and the doors to the courtyard were thrown shut and barred. And Yang's followers, they had just walked right into a trap. Now, I can't imagine the fear going through the crowd when they all realized what had just happened, and that this was most likely going to be their last night on Earth. You see, Hong, he was never really going to punish Wei and Regang. No, he just used them as a way of luring whoever else was left in the city that was loyal to Yang out of hiding. And once he got them all in one place, I'll just read a quote given by an Irish mercenary who just happened to be in Nanking at this time and witnessed the gruesome event go down. Next morning, at daylight, the doors and windows of these prisons were opened, and several powder bags were thrown in on the prisoners, while the entrance was strongly guarded. In one house, the soldiers entered with little resistance and massacred the whole. But in the other, the prisoners fought with the bricks from the walls and partitions, most desperately for upwards of 6 hours before they were got under. In addition to musketry, a 2-pounder discharged grape at them. These poor devils then stripped themselves, and many were seen to fall from sheer exhaustion. At last, Wei and Qin called upon their man to draw their right arms from their sleeves so as to distinguish them from number two's men. They then rushed in and massacred the remainder. We shortly after entered, and good heavens, such a scene. The dead bodies were in some places 5 and 6 deep. Some had hung themselves, and others were severely scorched from the explosions of powder that had been thrown in. These bodies were removed from this to a field and remained uncovered. After this, every master of a house in the city had to give an account of how many men, women, and children were residing under his roof, to every one of whom was given a small chop, which they wore on their breast, and if they found any of number two's men, they were to secure them for several weeks, and these people were brought to the execution ground in parcels of 5s, 10s, 100s, and 1000s, who were all beheaded. All the women and children also. Anyone who had eaten of number two's rice suffered. Number 2 is referring to Yang, since he was the second in command and the Taiping command structure. After the massacre was over, there was still another 3 months of Wei and Regang rooting out suspected Yang loyalists, and it's even said that 500 of Yang's palace women were executed in one go. And it said that in all, tens of thousands of people lost their lives due to Wei and Regang's purges. Now, while all this was happening, Shi Kai was on a campaign that was much farther than where Wei and Regang were conducting their affairs, so it took him longer to get back to Nanking when Hong called on him. But when he did finally reach the city and hear the news of what happened to Yang and his family, he wasn't happy. He berated Wei furiously, blaming all the killing on him, as well as saying because of what he had done, the Qing were much more likely to be able to defeat the Taiping now, since he had killed one of their greatest leaders. Well, Wei didn't take too kindly to being yelled at and blamed for everything. So he turned around and accused Shi Kai of being in league with Yang, and that he was also a traitor and was secretly aligned with the Qing government. As the two men were separated by their entourages, threats were made, and Shi Kai's friends, they told him that he's got to leave the city because they feared that he would be killed like Yang was. And luckily for Shi Kai, he listened to them because that very night, both Regang and Wei surrounded Shi Kai's residence, and when the night was over, Shi Kai's family and friends were all dead. Had he not slipped over the city walls in a basket earlier in the night, Shi Kai, he too would have shared the same fate. Of course, when Shi Kai heard of what befell his family, he was rightfully pissed off, and he began to gather men to his own personal cause, which was to rid the world of Wei and Regang. He traveled up the Yangtze River recruiting men, and because he was quite popular with the Taiping, he managed to gather a force of about 100,000 men strong, and when he was ready, he marched back to Nanking. And when he got there, he sent letters ahead of him to Hong, saying that all he wanted was the heads of the men who killed his family, and that he would stop the assault on Nanking if he got them. This wasn't about trying to take Hong down. This was just about those two guys. Well, Hong, not too happy with Regang and Wei already at this time, he had begun to fear that the two men, they were getting ready to try and seize power from him. So Hong, he saw an opportunity to get rid of both of them in one go. Hong, he assembled his personal bodyguard and devised a ploy to get Regang and Wei to come to him. And the next we hear of Wei is that his head is being sent to Shi Kai by Hong as a token of good faith and to show that he had avenged the death of Shi Kai's family. Hong, of course, also had Regang killed as well. And now, out of the 5 original kings, only 2 remain. This whole ordeal in time will become known as the Tianjin Incident. Now, during these trying times in the capital, let's just put it that way, the Taiping were doing much more than trying to kill each other. They'd actually sent out 2 different expeditions to try and further their conquests, and to also achieve their main goal, which again was to rid China of all the Manchu demons. specifically the Manchu government headquartered in Beijing. But we will have to get to the western and northern expeditions the next time, because this is the end of part 1 of the Taiping Rebellion. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, or listening if that's what you did. I mean, it's more of a podcast than a video, really, anyways. But either way, however you consumed this video, I don't know if that's the right word either. Hopefully you enjoyed. Little updates as well here. We still are in works on the second or Great Samnite War. That's still coming out. And obviously part 2 of the Taiping Rebellion. And I'm still doing my random challenge videos here and there. And you might just see a random video of a book summary or me reading a book about this dog, Max. Pretty cool. But besides that, yeah, hopefully you guys have a good one.